Ward Kohatup. Hello, everyone. Kamut Quest Winoptin. My Indian name is Big Voice Who Speaks the Truth. My English name is Wayne Christian. I'm going to begin this session with singing you a Secwepemc welcome song. I'm welcoming you into where I'm broadcasting from, which is our community center in Splatsin. And the welcome song is how we invite our guests into our homes and into our lands and to start building that relationship today. And that's what we will do. So I'm going to sing you this song. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, oh. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Welcome, Mittelman. I think I welcome you into our land, into our relationships with each other, and how to spend some time with you today, speaking about Satwa. So I'll be doing a PowerPoint presentation with Robyn, our territorial water manager, and we'll begin a process of interacting. So I bring it up, right? I'm trying to. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you so much. So Syilx-Okanagan, everyone. Sorry. Welcome to the Secwepemc Knowledge Relationships with Waterways. My name is Michelle Sam. I am asked by Living Lakes Canada to help support this series of Indigenous peoples-led relationships, right? How do we do this work that's Indigenous-led? And so I wanted to give a little bit of a background on, we're doing this Secwepemc informed this time. So if you were in the Ktunaxa knowledge relationship conversation last week, you'll notice there was a difference in how we started and how we are proceeding. And if you're going to be in the next one with the Okanagan, Syilx-Okanagan, you'll see a difference again, because we are different people. We are place-based people. We are culturally different, linguistically different. And so when I went about to find the folks, on behalf of Living Lakes Canada, to participate in this gathering, I actually was at the salmon fry reintroduction on the Columbia River ceremonies in May with Alfred Joseph, with Ktunaxa knowledge holder Alfred Joseph, and I was looking around for who can I ask, and I saw Wayne, and I'm familiar with Wayne in a number of the different hats he wears, but we were there in ceremony, and so I asked him if he would participate with us on this project, on this opportunity to be Indigenous-led, to show what Indigenous-led means from the Secwepemc people. And so he said yes, and then he brought Robyn along as well. And so I just want to remind us again that we're here with our hearts in the right place to learn, to be open-hearted, to think about how we're going to work together, and then open-minded as well, to understand the differences, right, and to be open-eared, to hear as well, to listen and to take in what Wayne and Robyn are going to offer us. So I have up on the screen, of course, just the little agenda. You'll notice that there are no times because it's fluid. Thank you very much for that, Wayne. And so I'm going to turn it over. Wayne, you've introduced yourself. If Robyn wants to introduce herself, and then we'll have introductions from Kat. Stop sharing my screen. Here's Robyn.
Go ahead, Robyn. Go ahead,
Okay.
Robyn.
Good afternoon. My name is Robyn Laubman. I am a visitor to the traditional territories of the Secwepemc, and also live in the traditional territories of the Okanagan, the North Okanagan. It is a real pleasure to be here. I'm the Territorial Water Manager with Splatcheen, the southernmost community of the Secwepemc Nation. And I really look forward to our discussion and speaking with you today. Kukpi7.
Great. My turn, Michelle.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Robyn. Thank you, Wayne. And thank you, Michelle, for your words. My name is Kat Hartwig. I'm the Executive Director of Living Lakes Canada, and I'm very grateful and glad that we have this time together today for some deep listening and so that we may learn from each other. So many thanks to all of you who've joined us today as well. Living Lakes Canada recognizes our collective work occurs within Indigenous peoples' homelands across what is now known as Canada. This webinar series focuses specifically upon the area we know today as the Columbia Basin, which is the homelands of the Ktunaxa, Syilx-Okanagan, and Sinixt Peoples since time immemorial. The intent of this webinar series is to support truth and reconciliation efforts through creating time and space for Indigenous place-based peoples to speak about the important and culturally specific relationship they each have with waterways that continue to sculpt the landscape upon which we live. This is an opportunity to rethink how we approach relationships in the future and how we may better apply what we've learned in our efforts to safeguard the water that we and all beings depend upon. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce then the rest of the Living Lakes team who are helping with the webinar today. So Emily, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily. I've recently taken on this role with Living Lakes Canada as their applied reconciliation coordinator. This role is exciting, evolving, new, and came from experiences like this. I'm dedicated to aligning our partnerships with Indigenous people within our water stewardship projects. And I will also be organizing the chat. So if you have any questions, you feel free to put them in there and I will read them out. And yeah. Up next, we have Nicole, my teammate.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Trigg. As the Communications Director for Living Lakes Canada, I'd like to thank you all so much for being here in this amazing space today. It's fantastic to see so many people join. I'll just take a moment to address how we'll manage the Q&A, slightly different from what Emily said. Please enter your questions into the chat box, which is located in your toolbar. And Emily will be watching the chat box and inviting those who have questions to unmute themselves to ask their question out loud. And we'll do our best to get through all your questions in the limited amount of time that we have. As well, a recording of today's webinar will be emailed to everyone who registered and will also be made available on our website. And we will also be sending you a post-webinar survey and would appreciate receiving your thoughts about today's event. Thank you again for joining today.
Thank you, Living Lakes. So I encourage you all to use the chat as much as possible. It would be great to know where you are all coming from, where you're all located. That's great for us to know. So while you're listening in on the presentation, if you want to say, if you see people that you know, if you start looking at names, if you start saying, oh, I remember that person, wave, say hi, you know, in the chat, let us know where you're from. That would be great for us to also know. Because often when we're gathered like this, normally we go through introductions, right? We follow protocols. And those protocols might seem like, oh, why are we doing it that way? Well, we're doing it that way because it's about relationships. It's about not one person, it's about all of us, right? And what are we going to do about what we're going to learn, right? So at the very end, I will be seeking out, just keep it in mind, 5 people. I'll, put your hands up and I'll call upon you at the very end. So you don't need to know right now what it's about. Trust me. I'm going to turn it over now to Kukpi7 Christian to start our presentation. And I think, Robyn, do you have share screen ability for your presentation?
Thanks, Michelle. I actually think Kukpi was going to be in the driver's seat.
Excellent.
And screen share.
Right on. You have screen share capacity? There you go.
Is it there?
Yep.
I just want to begin and say that everything that I'm presenting to you today is based on what I've gathered over the almost 7 decades I've been on this earth, from our knowledge keepers, from many different forms of people like Ron Ignis, people that have a real depth of knowledge about Secwepemc sort of principles, and a lot of it evolves around what's considered our oral history or our stories. And I, unfortunately, because of my mom was in one of those institutions where the institutions of genocide, she never passed on the language to me, simply because we have heard all the atrocities and what's happened over since the spring. And I think that so I'll be talking and using Secwepemc terminology. Now, some of the pronunciation may not be right on, but I'm trying to relearn that part of my history as a Secwepemc person. And it's connected to what we're talking about today, our relationship with the Satwa, the water. And I want to thank the organizers, Living Lakes, for this opportunity. And also Michelle, I know that in ceremony we had that discussion. And it's really an important part of what we have to do here today is how can I help people in this process understand the relationship we have with Satwa, and what does that mean in terms of legal oral history? Because it really is that the foundation of who we are comes from the water. So that's what I'm going to do today. It's the beginning point is always understanding who we are as a people, as a Secwepemc people. We have 32 communities, 17 Indigenous bands. The communities that are, quote, were considered extinct was not because of people weren't there, it's just the effects of smallpox. And we had a large number of our communities where they had to move into communities next to them because the numbers and the smallpox epidemic that took over our communities at that time. Our community, as an example, went from about 1,500 people down to less than 100. We almost were wiped out as a people from 1860 to 1871. So that gives you sort of an extent when we talk about us as a people, our Secwepemc people, and how it's important to know who we are. And our people have sustained and lived on these lands and waters for over thousands of years. I think documentation by archaeology says 12,000 years. But our people talk about it since time immemorial. We've been here and we're embedded in the land in many different ways. And it's really important to understand that our common beliefs and language, Secwepemc, we share through an oral tradition. And our Kosaltan are strong family relationships with each other. And then the knowledge of our knowledge keepers in our language is Stewards. It doesn't mean elders. What it means is old ones, the ones that have knowledge, Stewards. And I think that that's what's important, is that our culture and who we are was embedded in the old ones to pass that on. And that's what I'm doing here today. I'm passing what I know from the old ones that have taught me on to you in terms of as a Secwepemc people. We're one of the, like I said, one of the Indigenous bands of the Secwepemc Nation. We border, at the headwaters of actually the Columbia, actually, from the Okanagan side. We actually, the beginning of the Okanagan system, starts at the, in our backyard, basically. And we'll talk a bit about that later in terms of the impact of what's going on with water and aquifers, etc. So it's important to understand that concept. So Satwa, water. We know and understand this in our teachings, and it's really important. And we're taught, and the very important thing is that we were water beings before we became human beings. What do I mean by that? Is that we were taught that we were born into water in our mums, the embryos, and we were in water. We lived in water. And we lived in water for 9 months before we were given freedom by our mothers to come into the world. So we're water beings before we became human beings. And it's really an important concept. If you think about it in that concept, that water is the source of who we are as a people, as two-legged. And that we have to get and connect back to that. It's really the core of our spirituality and our worldview. And it comes from that process of water is the lifeblood of all living things. And we have to really understand that that in our relationship with water and land, it needs to be understood that we have responsibilities. Yes, we have rights, but we have more so is we have responsibilities for the water, for the land. Water is a humble but powerful spirit and a sacred gift of life. Like we started earlier, like I talked about being fluid today, it's like water. Water always finds a way, and we know that it gives life to many different things, and it's really an important core element, Satwa. And so in the context of water and the Secwepemc Nation, we have the headwaters. We've got about approximately 16 watersheds in the nation. And those watersheds flow into two major river systems, the Fraser River through the Thompson system and the Columbia River. So those two water systems, all the watersheds that exist in our territory and with our people flow into those two major tributaries of water. And it's important to understand that because through our nation is the headwaters of both. And if you've been watching and understanding what's going on with the climate, understanding that the ice fields and those things are being impacted, the glaciers are diminishing at a rapid rate. And it's really important to understand that. For us, we see this out our backyards and in the territory. So water is a central focus. And also understand that water, long before the development of the railways, the development of the roads, water was our transportation system. It's how we moved throughout the territory, how we moved with each other, how we moved, and sort of originally were the actual sort of waterfront property owners. We lived on the waterfront, the mouths of creeks, and the sustainability of our life, our winter homes, and those things were built in those strategic kinds of areas. So water has played a real significant role in who we are as a people, and I think it's important to understand that. The cycle of life. This concept, our old people tell us, is that life begins with that single drop of rain at the top of that mountain. And as it hits the mountaintop, and we understand, accumulates. And if you go to the top of these mountains, and if you're ever up there, I ask you to do this, put tobacco or an offering in that water, thank it for what it's doing to give life to everything. Because when it comes down off the mountain, it comes down and it feeds everything down along the way. If you think about it, it feeds all the medicine plants and things that are at the alpine level. and all those animals that live within that, the four-legged, the winged ones. It feeds and gives life to all of those things. And it's really, really important. And if you think about it as it comes down the mountain, as it comes down through these streams and down into the valleys and into the rivers and into the lakes and eventually into the ocean, but it feeds everything. The malama, our medicine, the people think of our treatlanku, all our food. The berries. Berries are seen as food, but we see it also as medicine. And Western science, those of you that have that kind of knowledge understand that things are the antioxidants they find in the berries, the huckleberries and blueberries. We know those things. And there's different types of medicines that the water actually feeds and gives those medicines to our people. And I think is really an important part of the process to understand that it is that way. Water feeds everything, and it fills, the lakes and the creeks and down, and as it goes back into the ocean, and especially the finned ones. And then how it is created through the atmospheric and it comes back as clouds and rain and starts that cycle all over. And this is going on throughout the world, not just here, but it happens throughout the world. And I think we're seeing the interruption in that natural life cycle of what's going on with the different things that are going on in the world right now, where water, torrents, flooding and those kinds of things, places where there's drought, that cycle of life, water has been interrupted by the two-legged. And it's interesting because if we think about it in this way, if we took all the two-legged off of the planet, things would flourish and things would grow back and refurbish of life again. But I think we have to understand our responsibility and the impact that we have as humans, two-legged on this planet, and what it does, especially in relation to water or satwa. It's really an important concept to think about, and the cycle of life. And I think it's something that even, where you live, wherever that is, a simple act of, as an example, developing places to, how do you put this, to help the water stay in the land more, because we understand like the forestry practices, as an example, are all about, creating clear cuts, and we know what that does to the water, just at the rapid flow down the mountain. And it has many devastating impacts. And we're going to see, as an example, after this wildfire season, what happens when the forest gets denuded in that way. And all of a sudden, we're going to have massive floods, mudslides, and things happen because the trees and all those things that hold Mother Earth together are no longer there, and they just release. And we're going to see massive destruction on the land because the amount of how important water is, and it's important to understand that because we understood that this past summer with the heat dome that took place, the immense amount of massive drought, severe drought that took place here in the interior of British Columbia, and how that impacted the wildfires and life, animals, and all of those things. So this is really important concept that, again, in science, they would tell you that this is what happens, but for our people, we're taught this, and when we talk about satwa, that single drop of rain gives life, and this is what it does. It feeds everything and gives life to everything. So just, it's really an important concept. It's core to our belief, and I think it's important part of who we are as Secwepemc people, as Indigenous people on the land. So our Secwepemc laws and governance, the laws that serve to help our people to decide how do we keep our relationships in balance and responsibilities, in sort of a principled, legitimate way. And I think it's really important to understand that our laws over water can be recognized and understood in a way which knowledge is transmitted between generations through oral stories. It's really important, that concept of how we transmit laws, and what does that actually mean in terms of the concepts of we're talking about today, especially around water, because water is so fundamental to life. And I think that we examine these stories, we can extract common principles that can be found in each of the stories and teachings. And these stories are interesting because the more you look at them, the simplicity of them are very powerful, but the teachings that they have, there's multi-layered. And I say that because I've done lots of work with children and some mammals and talking about inherent jurisdiction over children. And we have numerous stories about children. And it's interesting to me that every story we have about children, it's the ultimate price is always paid, and it's paid by the child. And usually the ultimate price is death. And these stories lay down a foundation of telling us what we need to do for our children and how we do that. And these stories are really integral, and they've been told over generations and generations, over and over to our people. So the oral history in that way is a way of transmitting that knowledge and that responsibility. I would say because of the institutions of genocide, they've disrupted that way of life and way of being. But we're coming back, we're beginning to understand and we get reconnected to the fundamental principles of who we are as Secwepemc people. And so that's really important to understand that these things that people call them myths and legends, but they're not. They're actually our oral history that our people can actually talk in such a way, and it identifies with different markers on the land. It identifies different things that happen throughout the territory, things that happen with the Ktunaxa as an example, the water people, and the beginnings of those stories. Some massive stories that are like telling a whole creation. The one I think about is the trout children in Pipso, and what happened up there in terms of that whole story. If you examine it and look at it, it talks about how water is really interconnected to the land, to the sky people, and how that's related to the land, and then in the water beneath the land in terms of the Ktunaxa. So these are massive sort of principles. And if you examine them and keep looking at them, you continue to understand the depth of knowledge. And it sounds simplistic, but the depth of teaching within each story. And I think that's what's important in sort of the oral process and the oral stories that we hold to be true. Clan. And what that means, the translation is poor and pitiful. Because we talk a lot about that, is that we are clan Kalmuk, or poor and pitiful humans. Because we understand that our ability and what we hold on creation, we're just a poor and pitiful part of creation. And it really refers to humility and human dependency. And it really is the key to understanding the legal principles and practices of respectful relationships. When we're talking about clan and that whole concept, it's really important to understand that it's that recognizing the significance, power of land, resources, and non-humans in relationship with people. And it really is that relationship that we need to understand. Because one of the things that when we talk about this is that poor and pitiful, and we humble ourselves, because we would understand then that things that are more powerful than us in a spiritual way, like the water as an example, the spirit of the water and the power of the water and the animal spirits and the trees, the belief we have is that everything has a spirit. And everything that has been brought into this world, as we understand it, has an actual spirit. And we need to humble ourselves to understand that. I think that's really an important part of that whole process. And these are some of the stories when we talk about teaching these principles. And I'll be talking about some of these in this. Some of the stories won't be here. I'll be giving you little snippets out of the stories, so you can kind of we can kind of understand what I'm when I'm talking about this process of poor and pitiful and clan. What does that actually mean in terms of how we sort of apply that in terms of who we are? This story is about Salmon Boy. And again, this I'll just sort of go through it with you, and then at the end talk about some of the principles and some of the things that we glean from this story. We had a boy who lived with his grandparents. He fell into the river and floated downriver to the land of the salmon. The salmon people let him stay until he wanted to return home. The salmon chief agreed to let the boy travel home when they made their run upriver, but then changes his mind because the trip is too dangerous. Because if you know salmon, the routes that they take to get back to where they were born is very dangerous for them in many different ways. And so the salmon chief thought that, hey, this boy, and in this case, probably the species of salmon would have been the sockeye, or the falconui, the real fish, as it's called in our language. It would be too dangerous for the boy to go with them on that trip. But when the king salmon, and the king salmon is known as the Chinook, Ktunaxa in our language. But when they started their run, the salmon chief gave the boy to their charge to the king salmon, and the boy swam with them until being transformed into a salmon. So he came up as a Ktunaxa or a Chinook salmon. He came back to his people in that way. The boy's grandfather believed his grandson was dead. If you can think about that and the concept of life and death, that the grandfather thought that his grandson has no longer in the world we have today. And so when the salmon started their run back up to their home, the grandfather made a weir across a small stream where he lived and fished by bag netting. And so if you know about weirs and in the river systems and stream systems, it's a form of management. It's you can take and choose which ones, our people are really good at that. They could choose which ones they would let go. So they would know that the males, the dominant males, and the females, they all let go. So they kind of knew that. But weirs were that process of how they manage that. And so it's important to understand that weirs, if you go all over the interior and the river systems that in our territory, there are weirs all over the place. And each one of them are built in different ways, and it's a way to manage the fish as they came and returned to their spawning beds or where they were born. So as the boy was caught with other fish, his grandfather was going to split and dry him. We noticed that the fish's eyes were like those of a human. The grandfather wrapped the salmon boy in a blanket and hung him in a tree. Over 4 days, the boy morphed back into human form until he jumped out of the blanket as the grandson. Grandson told his grandfather to keep his return a secret, to catch and cure all the fish he could, while the grandson hunted for 2 months. He would give a feast to the people when he returned. All of the people were surprised to see the boy, and he feasted them for many days. And these concepts are important, and this next part will tell you some of the things that really sort of the learnings and the sort of legal principles on this whole aspect of the salmon boy. So the first part of this story, the boy respected the salmon chief, and then you think about that and the concept of you respect sort of the leadership, you respect the person in charge, that authority, and he followed his direction, not to follow the sockeye, but to follow the Ktunaxa or the Chinook or king salmon instead, because of the dangers that would pose if he would have went with the sockeye. And what would have happened? He potentially would not have made it back home. And the boy was in the Salmon Peoples' land and not his own. So he had to humble himself and listen to the knowledge of the salmon chief, because he didn't know how to get home. And this is a real important process if you think about it. It's how when you go into another territory and you visit somebody else in their territory, you humble yourself. It's not your land, it's not your territory, it's not your home. You're going in as a visitor. And you have to humble yourself in that way because he didn't know the land, didn't know what to do. And so the boy became vulnerable and dependent on the salmon. And the salmon took care of the humans. The salmon held responsibility to look after the boy when he was in their lands and provide him with safe passage home. Because the salmon chief knew the different types of salmon, he was able to know where the boy could travel safely, and his authority came from knowledge. Again, this speaks to really clearly that knowledge. We talk about our Secwepemc, our old ones, they have that knowledge. And in this story is the knowledge about how you actually respect each other and how you actually give that information to others. And that also understanding there are different types of salmon and they have different life cycles, they have different returns to their home and all of that. And I think that's really an important lesson here is that all fish are not the same. It's like all us as Indigenous people are not the same. We have different ways of doing things. And it's very, think about it in that context of the world, we are not all the same. We have different ways that we do things. And we as a Secwepemc do things different than the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx, and the Interconnectedness. So you just start looking at those things, and I think it's really important. It's really an important lesson. Protocol, the boy worked hard for 2 months to gather resources he shared with the community to mark his return home. And again, it was really, a feast was held to honor the people and have them accept the boy back into the community, to honor the salmon people who kept him safe. And again, feasting and that whole process of food is really important because in this case, it was the honor, because if you think about it, the community and the people thought that this boy had perished. He was no longer alive, he was dead. But he came back with the salmon people, and the salmon people, the gratitude and to feast them and to honor them as well. Feasting is a way to do that. You hear a lot about that on the West Coast and the potlatch. It's a feasting system. And same as here in the interior, we do it differently, but it's about a feast and gathering together. And even today, when we sit down and have a meal together, it's like a ceremony. And we have to understand that because food is what gives us life. And we have to understand that when we do that, it's that feasting part of it. In this case, is to honor the two-legged and to honor the salmon. Those came together to save this boy. And it was important in terms of our culture and how it, sort of really honors people in important events. And just that little piece in this story gives you a real good indication as to feasting and how important it is in terms of how we actually utilize feasting as a mechanism. In this case, we're the Salmon Boy and his return to his people. And if you look at all levels in this story, the grandfather, he thought he had lost the boy, and then how he was, using the weir to selectively harvest, and how all of that came to be to bring the boy and putting him, in this case, in a blanket and hanging him so he could morph back into a human being because he could see that the eyes looked like a human. And so I think it's really those kinds of things that we start looking at the depth of this story. It gives you that whole connection that we as two-legged have with the salmon people, and why it's important. As an example, the first fish ceremony that we hold as part of honoring the salmon. In most of our cultures and our communities, the first fish is caught and it is held and it is given out, feasted out in little pieces to everybody. And then after that, the remains of that salmon is returned to the water. And it's really a whole process of honoring, and we have a salmon song where we invite and sing to the salmon. And it's all part of that. It's about the song, it's about the feasting, it's about the dance that goes with it. And the salmon are really an integral part of our culture and who we are and how important these stories are. And so it's important to understand that in terms of the context of oral history, what it teaches us. And this, again, through those institutions of genocide are the things that were taken away from our people. And we're reintroducing them and coming back to bring them back to our people in that way. So just understand, the oral history in that way. This is one story. We have another story that talks about coyote, or the old one, Snahukulu, in our language. It's not Skalep, that's coyote. So Snahukulu in our language is the old one. How he brought back the salmon up the Columbia River, and he brought them to different tribes along the river, and that he asked coming in and people feasted him, and all the tribes except one didn't feast him. So he turned around and he came back to the Secwepemc people and said, here, you're a kind and generous people, a humble people. You were poor and pitiful, but you shared everything that you had with us. And then he let us, we have a story where he turns his canoe over. We call it Coyote's Canoe. It's just not far from where I live, actually. And just the whole story around salmon and how, you know, there's a lot more to that story than that, but it really is about how that relationship between the salmon and human beings, and how the old one, or Sunhokolo, that one that was next to the crater, brought him to the people. And so, like I said, we have numerous stories on the salmon, and I think it's an important way to understand, because salmon without water, think about that, and that relationship with water and the salmon, where we see the impact that development has had on the riverways. We're seeing the impact it's having on the temperature of the water. We're seeing the impact of industrial farming on the water, and just on and on about the water. And I think it's important because it's like a keystone species. If it goes extinct, that tells you then that a whole ecosystem in the water has really been impacted, not by one thing, but a multitude of things along the waterway, you know, from the top of the mountain right to the ocean and back up. And so just think about that for a minute. And that's the importance of stories like this, to teach us as human beings how to relate to, in this case, the finned ones, the salmon people, and the relationship between the salmon people and the human beings, and how it's interrelated and how important it is. So those concepts are really critical when we talk about our laws, our Secwepemc laws, on our relationship, excuse me, to everything around us.
Wayne,
Yep.
Wayne, it's Michelle here. Apparently, the scratching of your mic is causing some folks some anxiety because they can't hear you very well. And so there's a bit of feedback from your mic on, I guess, when you're moving your arms. And I know it's really hard to figure out how we could do this, but I didn't want to interrupt, but I am being told that there's quite a bit of folks who are having a hard time. Yeah.
Okay, just give me a second. I'm going to switch to my AirPods. Okay.
Awesome.
Did they
That
connect?
Yeah, they did.
Apologize about that. Holy.
We didn't know if we should interrupt, but you were on a roll, and I was like, well, there'll be a natural flow. Are we Eddie?
We good? So the other concept that I think you'll hear this from a lot of Indigenous people around the world, actually, is the concept of interconnectedness, or all our relations. In our language, it's quietus renkaselton, all my relatives. And it's really important to understand that the interrelationship that we have, you know, with everything around us is really not just to each other, but with land, water, and four-legged winged ones, you know, the plants, and you start looking at the air, and all of the things are really important, because it's different than from when we talk about poor and pitiful clan. It's about quietus renkaselton. It's a whole different level of understanding the world and the worldview that talks about interconnectedness. And if you remember back on the slide around the water, you could see how that single drop of rain actually connected everything. You know, connected it from the top of the mountain, down along the mountain, you know, all the streams and lakes and back into the ocean and back around, and how water connects everything. And think about that in that concept, because when it rains, just remember where that water comes from and where it goes, because it's really an important part of the concept of interconnectedness, or quietus renkaselton. And it's distinct because it's really about our human actions that influential with the natural world that's in constant flux. You know, the interesting part, if you look at change, the world is always changing. Kika Tamik, or Mother Earth, all of the plants and everything is changing constantly. You may not see that, but that's what is actually happening, because the world is changing constantly. It's in a constant state of change. And people don't like change. So they put up things to think that they can alter the natural flow of things. You know, rivers is a prime example of that. Utilizing the natural flow for something and stopping the flow of the river. If you think about it in the context of trees and how trees are then removed, you know, to build homes and stuff, but it has an impact. It's all connected. And so the stories that some of the stories I'm going to talk about in this, we'll talk a bit about that in terms of that connectedness and how important it is. The interconnectedness of our relatives and how that shapes out. The old one, you know, Sunhocholo, as we call it in our language, not Skalep. Sunhocholo is the old one. He's the one that instructed Coyote to do what he did, Sunhocholo. And so he and the Scalia is the sweat lodge. And he taught the people to sweat bathe and make sweat houses or scalias. And he told them that when they sweat, that they pray to Squalas, who own the sweat bath, the spirit. And in English, it means open face. Because when you go into the scalia, it really is about telling the truth and being truthful about what you're looking for. And it's really an important part of the process, and it's connected. And the Sunhocholo said if they followed the instruction, they would be healthy and successful at hunting and gambling and things like that. Or just it's a way to be in connection one with oneself. And so Sunhocholo told Skolas that people would pray to him, and he would ask that spirit, the open face, to listen when we prayed and to help us. And then Sunhocholo then told the water, when the people wash and bathe themselves, to heal and answer their prayers. And so part of the scalia is the act of bringing water into the scalia and using it to cleanse oneself and to be part of that prayer. And it's really important as well that if you think about it, in the scalia, he also used the fir or cedar to make the actual frame and the fir boughs. You know, we brought in the rooted people as part of the ceremony, the scalia, you know, the trees. And then he brought in the scan, or the rock, the oldest living being on the earth, the sweat rocks, and bringing those in. And then he added the element of fire, using fire to heat those rocks and bringing them into the scalia. So it's in that kind of concept when we talk about the interconnectedness of water, you know, the trees or the fir, you know, fir boughs, cedar boughs, the rocks, and the fire and the air. It's all interconnected, because all of that together is then we as human beings utilize that aspect of the scalia to bring comfort to ourselves, cleansing ourselves, spiritual sort of connection, and all of those things. So it's really important that interconnectedness that is part of this process of understanding who we are as a people. And really, it gets down to, you know, in the focus of the story, if you think about it, you know, what is that relationship between people, water, land, and Squalas, or the spirit? What is that? What is that relationship? You know, if we think about it in that context of relationship, because when you have a relationship, you have to understand, and there's got to be sort of a two-way process. It's what I call reciprocal. It's like reciprocal relationship or reciprocal accountability, you know, between each other, between us and the water, us and the land, us and the spirits. It's that really important thing of how do we actually do that, you know, in terms of how do we actually respond. You know, how does one respond to the needs of others? You know, as an example, Satwa listens to the Sunhocholo, the old one, and in turn answers our prayers and needs, because he listens to the instructions of the old one to help, and then in listening to our prayers, he in turns answers those and helps us in that way. And Sakwa, it's really, if you think about it, it's like that reciprocal back and forth and how important it is to build in that kind of a concept. So how do we actually maintain health, openness, and success? You know, I think that that's kind of when we think about in the concept of you know, all our relatives and everything's connected. How do we actually create that for ourselves? Because that reciprocal relationship between humans, land, and water is not simply having that resource being used. It must be respected and protected, as it's the guardian and source of health and life. Like I was talking about earlier, our belief is that everything has a spirit. And if you offer up and thank it, you know, simply put as an example, the trees themselves in one of our stories talks about how he was the first wife of the old one. Like that's how we began, was that relationship between Sunhokulu and the tree. And that whole process, and the tree is like the mother of everything. And how, if you think about those trees, how they, in the big canopies, how they protect everything underneath it. And it's that kind of relationship that's reciprocal, because the little ones underneath it are protected by, in this case, think about old growth forests as an example, how everything under that canopy is protected by that canopy and is allowed to grow and to flourish, and how the root systems are interconnected, and how that whole process is really important. And that tree has a spirit. And so you ask the tree for help. When in the case that we do ceremonies around water, we ask the trees for help because they're part of that system that helps create rain and that whole ecosystem. So it's really important to help and think about that. And again, the people need the help of the spirit, the water, the fir tree to deal with sickness, to be healthy. And that's the overlap with Glen, poor and pitiful. And I think it's important. And we need to be really mindful of our obligations in exchange for their power, so to speak, of what they give to us and how they answer them, and the responsibility of Sunhokulu to help the people. Our obligations, and that's why I talk about it's not, we just quote don't have rights on the land, we have responsibilities on the land. We have a responsibility to look after things that are out there, to look after, you know, say the caribou as an example, to look after them so they don't go extinct, to look after the old growth forest so they're not totally wiped out. We have a responsibility. And I think that that's the concept of Ktunaxa of all our relatives. How do we help people connect those things? And even to the point where I think it's important to understand that as we evolve things, it's not just in the context of what's going on in traditional sort of uses of land, it's modern day concepts of how do we understand that everything is connected. The logging practices, as an example, is connected to the health of the forest or the health of the water. So how do we bring those people into the conversation? How do we bring the recreational users into the conversation? Because we're all connected. Because the whole thing is that if the forest is no longer there, the water is no longer there, we're all impacted. And it's going to have a devastating impact. We have to start understanding the concept of that relationship of spirit, the water, the land, and people, and bringing it together, all our relatives. Because that concept is really important, because to do harm to your relative, you won't. And that's really important in terms of kinship ties. And that's a way that we stopped the warring with each other in the interior, is through blood relatives. So I think that's an important part of it. So. In our language, Yukuminpan to me are stewards of the land, and Yukuminu Ulu, caretakers of the land. And it's really important, again, you know, this is where I think many concepts of the land and ownership and those things gets mixed up, because we're taught that you can't own the land. The land does not belong to us. We're here to look after the land. And I think it's really an important piece of it, because we think about the land, we have to remember Kika Tamik, or Mother Earth, it's the Mother Earth. There is only one Earth, and how we look after it's important. And so I think it's important, really, there are many stories that talk about our responsibility as human beings to the land, water, and to not seek more resources when there's no need, and not to take control over resources. And people should never over-harvest or waste resources within our control. And there's a listing of a number of stories here, and it really is that concept of over-harvesting, and I talked about it earlier, how our people were actually managed using weirs. We used to use hunting fences to hunt caribou, as an example, when they were plentiful, so we could selectively harvest animals. And I think those kinds of things are important concepts. It shows really clearly that we have a responsibility to the land, and to be stewards over the land, and to really sort of be guardians and to be yukumintan, caretakers of the land. I think it's important. So these stories that are listed here, and I'll go into some of them, sort of just amplify, again, understanding that these are stories, and what I'm doing is giving you a really Reader's Digest version, even less than Reader's Digest, because it's just snippets, right? Because they're very involved, and the evolution of these stories is, if you read through them, and you can take a story, one of these stories as an example, and read it, and then reread it and find something different, then reread it again and find something different, and reread it again and find something different. But the commonality of these stories is what's the critical piece is, because it's really important. In this case, it talks about the coyote, Syilx-Okanagan, and the black bears. And he saw 3 black bears in a tree, a mother and 2 cubs. And he said to himself, I'll kill all 3 bears and make their skins into a robe. So he took off the robe that he was wearing, and he tore it into pieces and threw it away, because he thought he was going to get a new robe. And then coyote, coyote's always getting into mischief, and he's the one wandering around. So he and the fox, he came across an underground house inhabited by rock rabbits, and he said to himself, I'll kill them all and eat them all. And coyote, usually what he does, he gets tired, he falls asleep, and he asks the fox, spare me 10. But the fox would continue to eat. And he said, spare me 9. And the fox continued to eat. And so he said, spare me half of 1, coyote said to the fox. And so the next one is about coyote and the swans. And when passing the lake, coyote saw 4 swans on the grassy shores. He sang and danced and caused the swans to lose their ability to fly. And coyote has this way of being a trickster, and he did those kinds of things. And he said to himself, we will cook and eat them all. And each one of these stories, if you look at them, they're really about over harvesting something and not and trying to reap the benefits from that, and being greedy in essence. And if we think about that concept of greed and how it, and we think about that in that concept, it's in today's, you translate it into today's world, the issue of money and monetary sort of over resources, whether it's animals, whether it's plants, water, etc. The greed that's associated with that kind of a concept, and how it really has an impact. So in this case, with the coyote and the black bears, he clubs the bears, but they were unaffected, because coyote's a bit of a wimp, actually, so he can't really club the bears. The bears are more powerful. Our bears, the bears are protectors, and they're strong. And so then coyote's original robe is gone. Now he's left with no robe at all, as a punishment for being greedy. So that's the coyote and the black bears. The coyote and the fox, again, despite fox's greed and eating all of coyote's rock rabbits, coyote's being punished for being greedy, for over harvesting in the beginning, because he gathered so many of them. And he was lazy because he was sleeping and wasting the plentiful food. He went to sleep rather than do what he was, waste the food. And is left with fewer resources as his magpie robe is blown away by the wind yet again. So again, that whole thing of being greedy and over harvesting and taking too much. And then not only that, being lazy and sleeping and wasting the food. And then again, the robe that he even has is gone. The wind takes it from him. So then the coyote and the swans. Again, coyote is greedy and trying to eat all the resources available to them. Again, after clubbing the swans and leaving them behind, the swans come back to life. You know, the swans we have swan songs, and the swan's really a powerful animal. It's about new beginnings and new life. And in this case, they came back to life, and his power over the swans did not have any influence after he mishandled them. Again, he's left with no food and great pain as he falls down a tree trying to recapture the swans. So each one of these stories in their shortened form, you can see it's about over-harvesting, it's about greed, and it's about how do we take this story and the concepts it has in terms of our Secwepemc law and apply it to over-harvesting. What do we do about it? What do we do about these things? And you'll hear a lot about that today in terms of the salmon, how we see the over-harvesting of salmon having an impact on the salmon and how that has an impact. How we're seeing over-harvesting of the trees, the fiber, and how when they're doing forestry, they're taking too much. And what they're replacing it with is a species that, as we know, creates like a firestorm out there because it's all the same species, and if it dries up, then it becomes, really that whole concept. There's consequences for those kinds of things of greed and over-harvesting, and I think we have to think about that in the context of water. What does that mean? How can you over-harvest water? And a big part of it is if you think about what's going on in the interior and the lower mainland, is the over-harvesting of water for farming. We're seeing along the Salmon River, as an example, and the Syilx-Okanagan River, a tremendous amount of water being taken out of these systems so the salmon can't live, to create massive sort of industrial dairy farms, large dairy farms that then contribute to the issue of pollution in the waterways. So you think about that over-harvesting of the water and that greed for the quota, their money, and how that's going to impact the whole ecosystem, not only the water itself, but the salmon, all the things that rely on the salmon along that way, all the four-legged, even the human beings that are impacted by the over-harvesting of water. So again, it comes back to that concept of greed and over-harvesting our resource. And water, I think people need to pay attention to that, because it's an over-harvesting of that water that, if you think about it, once the water is gone, it's gone. And where's it going to come from? And if the things that are happening in the world happen as they happen, is that water is not replenishing itself as fast as it once did, simply because the cycle of life, that water cycle, is being interrupted. And I think it's something to really think about in the context, and we talk about the Columbia Basin and all the Fraser River, we talk about Thompson, the Columbia, all these massive water systems that may seem like an endless supply, but it's going to be impacted, and we have to start paying attention to it. It's really, really important we do that. So the legal principles and Satwa, think about that concept of clan or humble yourself, poor and pitiful. Yokomintman, stewardship, quiet to strengthen self, interrelationship. So if you think about those as legal principles of how do we apply this in the relationships we have with water today, how do we humble ourselves, to the water, and how do we humble ourselves in a way that is really important to understand the devastation that's happening to our relative. And it is a relative because in our stories, we talk about them, and I mentioned this earlier, about Ktunaxa, the water beings. The water beings, and our people have stories about them, how important they are to our waterways, and they're part of the lakes and rivers, and all throughout the land is the water. And when I talked about that earlier story about the trout children, that is in that story, it talks about that relationship of the Kalmatatqua, the water beings, and how through those underground sort of connectedness through the aquifers come into the lakes and rivers and streams. And that's where the Kalmatatqua migrated out. And so then we have, places like where I live in Syilx-Okanagan and Mara Lake and Shuswap Lake and, Mabel Lake, all those are inhabited with water beings. And when you go on the water, it's important to understand that what we do and as part of our tradition is we thank the water, we offer tobacco to it, and we do ceremony for it. We haven't been on the water for a generation because our people, have canoes, dugouts, and we went on the water with a while back, and we did a ceremony in Mara Lake, actually, in the provincial park there. It was just fascinating because we asked the women to lead the ceremony. And the reason for that is that the women are life givers. They're the ones that carry us in water. And it's important that they honor the water beings. And we did this ceremony, and there was a picture that was taken. It was phenomenal, actually, because from out in the lake, people took a picture. And if you could imagine, like in the center where all the women and the carriers, pipe carriers, and doing the ceremony around were the men that were supporting. But then over top of the group where there were 4 figures, like in mist, like kneeling and praying. It was phenomenal to see. It just gave me chills when I saw it. And returning to the water and honoring the water people, it was like that connection. And so I think it's really important that these are things that in our history is that humble ourselves, to the water and offer those prayers and ask them for help, but also help them. And I think that's really an important part of it, part of the process. And I think those sort of legal principles, you think about it in the context of Secwepemc law or Indigenous law, it's not based on a cut and dry, this is it. It's based on these concepts of relationship and reciprocal accountability and reciprocal relationships, because we can't live without water, but the water could live without us. We couldn't live without the 4-leggeds, but the 4-leggeds could live without us. The same with the plant beings and the medicines. They could live without us, but we can't live without them. And I think that's the concept when we talk about legal principles and Satqua, is that reciprocal relationship and how important that is. And how we look after the stewardship of the water. And I think, and there's so many levels to this, because water, like I keep saying, water finds a way. If anything that we think about water, if you know water, and if you see it around rock and you see it around different areas, it finds a way. And I think that's we have to be like that. We have to be like water. And I think that's it may seem simplistic, but we must find a way to help the water. And I think that's what we all need to do in terms of what's going on in the Columbia Basin, with all the watersheds, with all the logging, with all the recreational development, just on and on. We have to find a way to help the water. And I think that's what's important in this process. So it's really that kind of sort of dynamic and where we need to sort of go with this in terms of the legal principles around what we actually do. Yeah, sorry about that. I just got a text message here. Mike. It's all good. It's all good. So the legal principles of Yukuminman or Yukuminnohul caretakership, what does that look like? Because I said earlier, we've sort of in some ways are starting to buy into that concept of ownership of land. And the old ones tell me is we don't own the land, we belong to the land. And I think that we have to understand that whole concept when we get into the struggle around land and even water. We don't own the water. It's really important that concept is not about ownership, it's about stewardship and caretakership and responsibility for the land, responsibility for the water and everything within it. So that's the concepts in these stories, and we think about our oral history that talk about that. And the other legal principle is around what does that actually mean in terms of the concepts of how is everything relate? You know, and I think that I just bring you back to that picture, that slide earlier, you know, when that water comes at the top of the mountain and how it feeds everything, literally everything, including the human beings in that cycle of life, just around and it just continuously. And that's that disruption that's taking place in climate change. It's disrupting that cycle of life. And so we're seeing more and more drought as an example because the water is no longer there. And that's happening because of global warming. We just start looking at all the factors, right? And so we have a responsibility to understand, to teach others that, hey, for Waitis Rent Consultant, everything is related. Everything is related to what's going on. And even the economics are related. You know, forestry is related. We just start listing all of the things off. It's our duty as human beings to create the knowledge with others that everything is related. It's like how we actually interact and have that reciprocal accountability to the water, you know, to every being, to all the trees, the animals, the fish, etc., is really important part of the process. So I think we have to begin to start looking at these things as being critical in terms of who we are as you know, as a people, and how we actually bring this stuff to the forefront. Because the unfortunate part for me, and I said this earlier, is that because of the institutions of genocide, our way of life and our way of knowing and understanding has been disrupted. And right now we're having, you know, lots of stuff going on, and people are in a state of, in many cases, shock still about what's happened since the 215. And it's that whole process, I think, is really, people need to understand that our way of life has been interrupted, but we need to understand this, is that that disruption has only been for the last couple hundred years. Remember, you know, thousands of years before that, we lived in an ecosystem and we lived in harmony with everything because of these legal principles that are embedded in our stories, our oral history. Because these stories are thousands of years old. They've been passed on from generation to generation. Just understand that it is coming back. We'll bring it back. And so I think that people need to understand that as part of the process, that that's what we're doing. We're bringing it back. We're in that time of renewal and that time of purification. Whoops. So it's simply put, we rely on water. Like I said earlier, the water will prosper with or without us, and on Mother Earth, because we need to treat it as sacred, because it is the source of all life. It's the source of our lives as human beings. You know, and Waitis Rent Consultant as human beings, our actions and the way we treat the land, reciprocal is really important. You know, if we poison the water, then the water will poison the animals we eat, the plants we use as medicines. And if we don't care for the water, it stops caring for us. It's that reciprocal relationship. It's embedded deep within our genetics and our DNA and who we are as a people on this land. And it's really important concept, that interconnectedness. You know, and I think why I think things are the way they are, we could see that as two-legged, no matter what race we are all connected. And I think our people understood that when contact happened. And yeah, we were treated as less than human, as subhuman, but our people understood that we had to talk about how do we actually work together. Because in the Wilfrid Laurier Memorial of 1910, our people talk about it in this way. We will treat each other as brothers. We will share in everything 50-50. What is mine is yours, and yours is mine. We will stand each other up to be great and good. And I'm just paraphrasing, but in that one statement in the 1910, our ancestral chief said to the government of the day, the Liberal government, Laurier said, look, we have a reciprocal relationship. We're related in this, because we treat each other as brothers, then we share everything together, and we stand each other up to be great and good. if you take that out of this and we talk about that's what we all need to do, stand each other up to be great and good, because we're all related, we're all interconnected. And it's so important we understand that as a process. And again, the Syilx-Okanagan, this is one of the things we struggle a lot with because understanding that the Indian Act and the reservation system that was developed and how they herded us into these areas, took us off the land, took us off the resources, and took us away from the ability to actually look after the land and to go to those places where we've been harvesting and managing, whether it's plants, animals, trees for thousands of years, and placed on these reserves where it was illegal to leave, where you had to actually seek permission from the Indian agent and the RCMP so you could leave the reserve boundaries. That created hardship to the level of that our people have lost connection to the land, and we're just starting to go back onto the land now. And I think that's all part of the whole disruption that's taken place, and we're reclaiming our rightful place in the world actually as Syilx-Okanagan, caretakers of the land, Syilx-Okanagan, caretakers of the land. And so as we do that, the management and the over-harvesting and the usage of water and animals, that'll start to come into balance again. Because without us doing our responsibilities and our rightful place as stewards of the land, is that the land was developed and all those things were just allowed to explode and to be utilized up in that way. And so again, it is about our ability to take that responsibility again and to stand up ourselves and to stand up our nation, to stand up our laws over the land, and to govern those resources again in a meaningful way. Because again, it's not that we're, quote, against development. It's about how it is done and how it can be done in a sustainable way. Even forestry, what are the practices that can be sustainable so that when we actually do forestry practices, it's not just for the fiber, it's for the water. If we understand that the clear cutting, that has a devastating impact on water. So how can we change the practices so that we're actually moving into a process where we see the forest as a living infrastructure, and the concepts of our concepts and the Western science can walk hand in hand, and walking on two legs principle, and how we can actually begin to start doing these things in a more cohesive manner and help each other through Western science and our Indigenous-led science to actually make these things work. Because we know, and people may not think we know, but we know. We've been doing this for thousands of years. We're just starting to find our voice again. So it's really important to understand that process. Excuse me. So I'll just do this one slide, and then I need to take a break, my voice. Okay, Michelle?
I didn't realize that. You can't see me. I'm saying yes and putting my thumbs up. You go for
Yeah,
it.
I don't have that up. I can see the slide, so, okay.
No worries. I've been nodding this entire time. Okay, go ahead.
So we'll just finish your slide, and then we'll go into a break, and then we can transition into the next piece. But we really need to think about this, and we think about knowing and our knowledge and who we are. It's the priorities for water are really clear. We have to approach our relationship with the water from that holistic sort of interrelationship. We have to approach the relationship with Satqua as a relationship where it's a living entity. It's not just something to be used. It's not a commodity. It gives life. It gives us life. It gives everything life. You have to respect it. And I think that's really important. Respect the rights, of the water, because as a living entity, it has rights to live. So how do we help it live? And I think that's what's really important. These priorities, we think about Satqua and how we actually do that. How do we we've heard stories of where they're giving the rivers given legal rights. And so is that the way to go? No, I think it's more about how do we actually embed it in us as two-legged, that it has rights and respect it, and it has rights as a living entity. We have to embed it in our knowing, in our knowledge, and how we carry ourselves when we're out there on the water, when we're out there in the mountains, when we're out there doing the things we do on the land, respecting it and giving it that respect it is by offering to it and thanking it for giving us so much for so long. And it's now our job to turn around and help the water. And the third priority is really working together, because we need to have healthy water, for future generations. I think about the drinking water advisory that's gone. I've been asked that question, and I said that's a product of systemic genocide. The drinking water advisory. Why do I say that? Because you have this whole department that was organized in such a way that it allowed us to do nothing. It did everything for us. And what it did for us was nothing. Think, for instance, what's happened with the people in Grassy Narrows with the mercury contamination. That was brought up in the 1960s, 40 friggin' years ago. And the response from the government and the Indian Affairs, this agency that's a part of the genocide, the Indian Act, they did very little or nothing. And they allowed that water to get contaminated. And now the people are poisoned by it. There's health concerns. Now they step in, oh, well, do a water plant now. Why the fuck? Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Apologize.
No, thank you for that, because I'm usually the one that swears, Wayne.
Apologize about that, but that's the anger, right? It's that whole the drinking water advisory is a result of that systemic genocide. It's called the Indian Act. It still exists today, and so we have to find a way, people, to work together to secure so places like Grassy Narrows don't happen now and don't get solved for 40 years. All the drinking water advisories are a result of how the bureaucracy has been really designed to treat us as non-human, that we don't exist as human beings. And I think that's what people have to understand. So I just want to leave it there for now and take a break right now. But I think this opportunity to share this part of it, and then after the break, we'll go into a little more. I do appreciate it. So who's managing the break?
If you want to stop sharing your screen, I think that would, that's awesome. If you can just click on the top and then you can stop sharing.
Right there?
Yeah, right there. Right there. So thank you very much. Let's take a 15-minute go outside, get some air, because I think we're all inside, and we will come back at 10 after 2, 10 after 3 Mountain Time. Okay? Yeah? Turn off your screens. That way we know when you're back. Thank you so much. And we'll pick it right up after you all come back. Hi.
Oh, that's right. I did see Sue's name there. I apologize.
Ryan, your mic is on. On again.
I apologize for disrupting the meeting there.
Oh, you didn't at all.
Crazy little thing when somebody calls on another line, it automatically unmutes you on Zoom. So
No worries. I was just more, actually, I was more concerned that that you knew that you were unmuted. So
I very much appreciate that. Yeah.
I've been in a few meetings where people don't do that, and I'm like, that's not fair. That's just not fair. Anyway,
Oh,
it's
thank
nice
you.
to meet you, Ryan.
Nice to meet you too.
Where are you located at?
I'm in Kamloops
Okay.
here. Yeah, it's great hearing the stories. I work a lot with Robyn and
Oh, okay.
and the Yukman Yulu team, so it's great hearing a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my sisters lives in Kamloops there. She's always lived in the area.
Not too far from Salmon Arm area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you're there and you're behind a black screen with your name, maybe you can just put up an icon. Thumbs up, pick your favorite reaction icon and let us know you're back. Or your face. It's hard to see. I know we've got a couple minutes still, but just to see, we've got over 100 people still with us halfway through, or well, I guess just a little bit more than halfway through. And I appreciate that. And I always appreciate people taking their time out of their day. I know there's a lot of meetings and there's a lot of things that we're pulled and pushed to. So making time, space, and place for Indigenous people's knowledges is a practical action for people to, as we're trying to do all this truth and reconciliation work. One of the biggest actions is actually listening and thinking and allowing the listening to change our minds, literally change our minds. And, I'm reminded just before we start up again, I'm reminded of, the trauma, right? The developmental trauma, the intergenerational trauma, the historical trauma, the acute trauma, right? The ambiguous loss, and how that actually is not just human in us as human beings. It's actually in the landscapes and waterways as well, especially when you consider how many generations we were not allowed to participate in at the tables. And so I know a few years ago I got to do some work around that for my own people, around the truth and reconciliation and the impacts to the river systems that we remember as like 50-year-olds, and those water advisories and understanding developmental trauma of industry, of practices, right? Land management practices. And so something for us to think about when we get together and think about the developmental trauma on water too, right? So we also, I know for healing human beings, we have those traditions. And so I think, Wayne, you've just provided us with recognizing we actually have those traditions related to water and landscape as well. We have those stories about how we're supposed to be. The other piece that I started picking up was on boundaries, right? Those roles and responsibilities. I know you know Gwen Phillips. So Gwen and I often share words, right? So responsibility for us was the ability to respond. It's not this, you're not being responsible. It's this is happening. This is what I can do about it, right? And the community, the common unity, what brings us all together. And then, I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of the boundaries too. right? Is understanding our boundaries and being good with our boundaries, right? Being able to let that interconnectedness happen by recognizing what our boundaries are, our roles and our responsibilities, enabling others to do the same. And so I'm going to turn it over to, am I turning it over to Robyn or to Wayne? Wayne, you're on my left, and Robyn, you're on my right on my screen here. That's why I'm like, which way am I going?
I'll start it, then I'll turn it over to Robyn, okay? Because I got to share my screen again, so.
Yep, go ahead. We're all back.
Oops, what's going on here? We're all back. So I thank you, Michelle, and what we're going to transition into next is a piece around specifically an aquifer. And this is one of those interesting things is when we're talking about water in the Columbia, our community where I live actually is called Halkal, and they couldn't pronounce it when the settlers came in, so they changed it to Halkar. Is the name that they use for this area. But this Halkar aquifer, Halkal aquifer contamination is, like I said, starts at the headwaters of the Columbia system on the Okanagan lakeside. And so we've been doing lots of work around this area, and Robyn's been involved. So what I was going to do is I'll do the slides, and Robyn, you just let me know next slide, but she's going to run through some of the things that we're doing in relation to the aquifer and its relationship to Satqua and how we're approaching it and what we're doing, because it is really an important part of the work, because like I talked about earlier, is that the water systems are all connected. And when we're talking of lakes and rivers and creeks and streams and mountains, we need to be talking about the aquifer and the groundwater, because this is where it all ends up, is in the aquifer. When those aquifers are dried up and done for, polluted, the ability for us to have clean drinking water is no longer there. So we're trying to interrupt this cycle early on because of the industrial farming that's taking place in this valley. So Robyn, I'll do the slides and I'll just turn it over to you, okay?
Kukpi7, Kukpi, Christian. Hi, everyone. I'll do my best to follow all the wisdom that Kukpi Christian was shared. So bear with me. So as previously indicated, the Halkar aquifer, and thank you also Kukpi for pronouncing the Secwepemc word for that valley. It's in the Deep Creek watershed, and it flows. It feeds into the aquifer for part of it, and then the aquifer actually recharges or flows back into Deep Creek further south, and the Deep Creek watershed flows into the Okanagan Basin and is a tributary into the Columbia River system. There's a figure here on the slide which shows the general area of where the Halkar aquifer is located, and the aquifer is actually two aquifers that are one on top of the other, and there are some connection points between them. And it is really about groundwater. It's a drinking water source for many of the Splatcheen residents and community members. The reserves are located on either side of the aquifer, and the primary land use in this area is agricultural operations. And there's a more recent history of that land use in that area. One of the practices that has caused concern, a serious concern, and health advisories is the spreading of manure. And farmers will do that to increase nutrients in the soils for their crops to uptake during the growing season. Now, this area has been found to have nitrate levels that are well over the 10 milligram per liter maximum acceptable condition. And that's a Health Canada drinking water guideline. Nitrates are a health concern, primarily for the very young infants, so less than 6 months, and it can cause something called blue baby syndrome, where they're deprived of oxygen because their blood proteins they get altered by the nitrates. But there is also some recent scientific studies that suggest there's connections with cancer and as well as changes to thyroid function. So all in all, it's just not a healthy thing whatsoever. So with these high nitrate levels, there's been water quality advisories issued between 2014 and 2019, although there were contamination issues prior to that, like before the 1990s even. So the monitoring wells, there's a system of monitoring wells throughout, which continue to show elevated nitrate concentrations. And what we're learning, working with groundwater experts, is that nitrate levels in the groundwater could take decades to return and recover back to normal levels, which should be well below 1 milligram per liter. So this summer in this area, there were significant drought conditions. There were water shortages for people living in this area. And, with the wildfires, it was just a lot of pressure on the system. And it could be argued that it reflects broader regional issues and concerns. So those are some of the known issues that we've been experiencing over the last few years. And certainly this past summer was considerably challenging for all sorts of reasons. Next slide, please. So we're working with partners within the provincial government, as well as with First Nations Health Authority, because there are many people who are involved with water governance and have water jurisdictions, but they're piece by piece. And so what we're trying to do is bring them all together and talk about how can we really protect water from a broader scale, and not just address drinking water contamination from a symptoms basis. And with water treatment, we want to help the source recover and be healthy. And so there's a source to tap multi-barrier approach that we're working towards, and trying to get away from this reactionary response, and also in recognition that this is a long-term relationship and long-term effort. With nitrates that are still going to be in that groundwater and soils for decades, we're going to have to really work at it for forever, as long as we're able to be there. And we've incorporated source water protection plans to support that process. Again, that's about addressing it from the source rather than at the end point, because we want to get away from that reactionary treating the symptom approach. We want to look at it from a watershed scale, because of that source, that rain, at the top of the mountain. It's all connected, and it all comes down to the ground. And that's where we really need to approach and address the conversation. As I mentioned, we're working with multiple water authorities, and certainly within the community. It's important that we've got that feedback and our understanding the changes, the status of and conditions of people's drinking water, and concerns and ways that we can support and encourage water conservation practices. So every drop counts, especially as we consider climate change conditions. Like this past summer was probably the biggest example of what what we could be living amongst and with, and it's scary. So really learning how to shift our relationship with water and encouraging water conservation practices, not just at a domestic level, but with every water user in the area. Next slide. I think that might be it. Yeah, that's it from me. And so I believe this, Kukpi, if you had anything else you wanted to add about.
Just a second, Robyn. Earlier when I was speaking, I was talking about the actual impact. This, we're talking in this isolation with the Halkar, but our quote reserve lands, the IR number 2, which is Enderby, has the Shuswap River that flows through it. And then the Salmon River has the Salmon River that flows through it. Both of those river systems and watersheds are actually, there's a study being done right now about the nitrate level and contamination. The Salmon River one is, the concern is because of the low usage, like I said, the usage of water there is having a real impact on the salmon. And I think that those are the things where we talk about looking at the whole, how this impacts all the way down the scale. But specifically with this one, the Halkar, it's these aquifers that are all over British Columbia are impacted by water usage right from the very top of those mountains. Because we notice the flow, as an example, because of the flooding that takes place with when you're doing clear cuts at the top of the mountains and how that comes down into the valleys. So these are just some of the things that I think are really important in terms of how this relates to everything that we're doing in the overall sort of process and perspective. Because, drinking water, aquifers, we have to start paying attention to these types of impacts. And farming is not like it was 50 years ago. It's not the mom and pop shop with 100 head of dairy cows. It's these industrial farms that actually have migrated over the lower mainland, the Fraser Valley, up into the interior, that are industrial in scale, like 3,000 head. And the contamination of the aquifers, the application of that liquid manure on the land, and how it's getting into our contaminating our water system. So that's the importance of this, and that's why I think this. You always think about this in the context as well of the, what they're doing with bio waste and what they're bringing that into the interior and using it as a form of fertilizer for the lands and how that's impacting the aquifers. So that's the connection with this in a broader scope. And our solutions really is looking at the whole, because it's all connected. And how do we bring everybody to the table to create some resolution and solutions? Because I live in this valley and I've never had a drinking water. I've been living there for 30 plus years. And only within the last 3 years, I've had, a boil water advisory because of the contamination. So it's like, hey, what's going on, And I think that that's the unfortunate part. People don't look at the reciprocal accountability, the ability to what we're doing with water and how it impacts everything else, the interconnectedness of it all. So thanks, Robyn, for presenting this. Appreciate it. I think we need to queue up the videos next, I believe. If I'm
Yep.
not mistaken, correct?
Sure, I'll do that right now. Just one moment.
Okay.
Yeah. And then if people have questions, I suggest you start piling them into the chat room. And then Emily, we will turn it over to you to host that. So if you've got questions while we're queuing up and changing gears, please get them into your chat, everybody.
Okay, please let me know if there's an issue with the sound. I'm starting it now.
Kuksteku de geld Kukpi7 te temich ku. Yuhuaminda wa wyatt te stem na elia na temich. Yuhuaminda ra galmuch ra temesmes kran ra spipuya ra
Do I have to
sash
leave the share?
qua esh ra stiflens ku.
Is it in the PowerPoint or is it in a link?
Ku. Kuksteku de geld Kukpi test.
Sorry, isn't it playing?
No,
No.
no, it's a black screen.
Okay, just one moment.
Are you sharing it, Nicole? Because I think we're still looking at Wayne's screen.
Yeah, no, I was sharing it and it was playing. Oh, someone said they
Okay.
were seeing it.
Wayne, can you stop sharing your screen? That's what the issue is. There we go. Okay, go ahead there, Nicole.
Okay, just one moment.
I can do the Vanna White.
Okay, let's
We
try.
were seeing the video.
And you weren't hearing the sound?
We were hearing sound and the video.
Oh, because mine was completely blank, black.
Okay, let's try that again.
Okay.
Kuksteku de geld Kukpi7 te temich.
Are you hearing it?
I'm hearing it. I'm not seeing a video.
Wyatt te stem na elia na temich. Yuhuaminda ra galmuch ra temes.
Okay, I'm going to try that one more time. It might be because I have a secondary screen going.
Oh, there we go.
Kran ra spipuya ra sash qua esh.
Oh, it went away. Oh, there we go.
Kuksteku de geld Kukpi7 te temich ku. Yuhuaminda wa wyatt te stem na elia na temich. Yuhuaminda ra galmuch ra temesmes kran ra spipuya ra sash qua esh ra stiflens ku. Knuhwenda ku as yalyalts ku. Kuksteku de geld Kukpi7 te temich te wa wyatt te stem.
I was born and raised in Windermere and have lived on this river and the Lake Windermere all my life. I didn't realize that we had salmon here in this river, and you know, they were like huge salmon, and it would feed a whole family, and it was revolved around our culture. You know, that's what we would eat, and there was ceremony around it and all those things that we lost. This is what we have today, is this beautiful river that's flowing, but we don't have the salmon. It's a tragedy, really, what's happened.
We used to be able to walk across the backs of the salmon across here, the old people used to say. Or it'd be so thick, all you would see is red. You'd think it was blood red, but it's the fish. Those salmon used to come right up this river, right up to the top there. Obviously the salmon coming up once a year,
they would all come together and they would sit at this area and wait for them. And I guess in the evenings or something, it's when they would come up and they would all head to the water. They'd have spears, I guess, and weirs, and who knows. But there's nothing left up there. Found one. That's a nice one.
That's a very important spot for us as Shuswap Indian Band because of the, well, obviously it was a harvesting site, but it was one of our harvesting sites that we know was communal with not only ourselves, but we fished there with the Ktunaxa people as well.
The salmon, you know, they were quite big, and the Shuswap people lived on them, used them as their staple food. It must have been devastating for them to lose it after that.
I couldn't imagine 1 year not having salmon, whether it's Chinook, sockeye. I couldn't imagine. I couldn't imagine how they felt, you know, that year that nothing came.
So Grand Coulee was the nail in the coffin for the most part, right? 1930s, when they put the Grand Coulee in, that was what stopped all the salmon from coming into Canada. Well, since then, we have, you know, we've had more dams built. So there's numerous dams on the U.S. as well as the Canadian side of the borders that hinder, if not completely stop, fish from going through.
Who gave permission? Who was consulted? So many dams. I don't know how many dams in that river.
When they built a Michael Dam there, they never even consulted with their people. And, you know, they just simply went ahead and done it without any consultation, huh?
They never thought what creating these dams without any fish pastures would do to them.
They not only lost the access to the resources, but they lost access through the Indian Act to their Kwaseltan, to their relatives in the rest of the territory, because they were restricted, their movements were restricted to being on their reserve. So the things that they lost that they're still trying to revive today and revitalize today are the salmon ceremony, the songs and the laws.
They lost all our salmon in 1941 or somewhere in there. They put the last salmon out when they closed the gates of the Mica Dam, and they built it with dams without fish ladders.
The last one that was caught was in about 1945, and it was 4 feet. It was huge, and it was actually caught in Briscoe.
The salmon were a gift to us. The salmon were gifted to us to help us feed ourselves. We not only need to have respect for the salmon, but we need to have respect for everything else.
When they were building that dam there, they knew that they were taking away our lifestyle. So to compensate us, they started issuing our band's spam in exchange for salmon.
For the loss of the salmon, the government was giving our native people spam. And I remember growing up with that.
Without salmon in our diets, we're looking at a lot of health concerns. Our lives, our way of life, our ability to, you know, heal ourselves spiritually while we're fishing, because we're not there just to fish. We're there to be a community, of a healthy, thinking, functioning community that relies on coming together to access salmon.
So that's a traditional food that we use all year round. You know, very, very important. You know, to subsidize
omega-3s and all those oils, you know, to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So yeah, salmon's, it's not only a spiritual thing, you know, it's a need that our body needs all year round, right? Is that those oils, right?
In the loss of salmon skeleton in the Columbia River system, you know, has created a lot of hardship with our people because they didn't have the food. That was the main source of food. You know, some of them starved. You know, our people starved because they didn't have that salmon.
My mom had to go to jail because she killed a couple of cattle to feed us.
Where the Kinbasket Lake sits now was a really rich gathering area for us. We had done a lot of our gathering there for right from cedar root gathering, salmon fishing, berry picking, hunting.
You know, we had colonization, and we had mission schools. They took away our salmon. Those are all genocidal type of impacts.
It's kind of sad, you know, we lost our language here. The last person that spoke the Kinbasket dialect passed away a couple of years ago. And that was the last speaker of the Kinbasket language.
There's words that are only used when you're fishing. If you aren't fishing, those words are gone. I don't know those words because they're gone.
You got to be able to fit in with Mother Nature and be part of it. A healthy ecosystem is exactly that. It's a healthy environment that you can go to and you can be healthy.
There was a spawning ground here back in the day for salmon, and I think that's what that weir was used for. When your rivers ran red in salmon, right, it was a lot easier to feed your families. So I don't think they could right the wrong, you know what I mean? But you got to start somewhere, and I believe that getting the salmon back in our water is a step in the right direction.
Today, there are ceremonies on the Columbia praying for that salmon to return. Every year there's a ceremony that goes on. It's prayers and hope that, you know, one day that the salmon will be brought back into that river system.
The Columbia River Treaty is a transboundary water agreement between Canada and US. This time, the First Nations, the Ktunaxa, the Okanagan, and the Secwepemc got together and said that they wanted to be sitting at the table to be a part of these negotiations. It's been a couple years in the renegotiation process. So within that, we're including our cultural values in there, ecosystem studies that all three nations are being involved in.
How do you repair the damage that's been done to our traditional ways and our ceremonies and our own Indigenous laws? How do we repair that? How do we revitalize that? That's something that needs to be addressed in the renewal of this treaty for the Columbia River Dam. That's a piece that has to happen. There needs to be a cultural revitalization component to it.
Well, we all use salmon as our main staple to live a long time ago. So now would be a good time to get together and fight for a good cause. Get the salmon back.
There's no one that knows this river better than Indigenous people. And so, you know, it isn't for BC to make those decisions or Canada to make those decisions. It's a joint decision with the nations that live along this river as well. I think it's about time that we started really working together to make this a better place and to give back the culture to the Indigenous people that were here to begin with.
The Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative. It's a 3-year initiative, Indigenous-led, how to reintroduce salmon into the Columbia River Basin. It's the 5 governments, so Ktunaxa, Okanagan, and the Secwepemc, and BC and Canada. So we're all sitting at the table now to discuss options and ways on how to get the salmon back into the Columbia.
As that group, we look at the feasibility and the opportunity to restore salmon back in Columbia River, because we can't just start dumping salmon into the river expecting it to be miraculously saved and restored. We have to do our due diligence in terms of protecting what's here now, right? Our resident fish stocks are very important still. We do not want to harm them.
Those salmon have a spiritual connection to where their ancestors, be it 80 years ago, would go to try and swim through and spawn, but now it's blocked, so those salmon are still coming, trying to get through. Their spirits want to be home. And just like a salmon's always trying to get back to its home, it's spiritually connected to its home, where their ancestors are from, kind of like us.
They're born here, they die here in Secwepemc. So for us, it's about looking after where they're born and where they die, and it's a part of our culture. We have a responsibility as caretakers of the land, and so that's what it's about, but also caretaking the water, because it really is the water. Water is life.
This isn't just about people, you know, this is about the whole life cycle, you know, and it starts with the little insects in the water, right up to, you know, the salmon. Who are the salmon feeding? Not only us, but, you know, there's the bears and there's the cougars and the, you know, all the animals in this valley. I can't even start to name them. There's so many that live off the salmon. So it's going to be inclusive to not only humans, but all wildlife.
It's very powerful because we're all being united, and it is a collaborative front, right? So this initiative is Indigenous-led. So each nation, the Ktunaxa and the Okanagan and the Secwepemc, working together and sitting at these tables, it's just powerful. We can't do this without all 5 of us.
The ability to practice ceremony, speak our own language is all but lost in our community. And I feel that salmon will be instrumental in helping to return that.
It's a powerful thing to think that, you know, one day their community will have salmon again. Of course, it's going to take a long time before the salmon come, but we're starting. And at least it may be there for our future generations, right? But we have to start somewhere.
We need to stand up for the water. We need to stand up for our salmon. We need to stand up for our people so that we can bring the salmon back.
It's for everybody. It's for those yet unborn.
It would be a great thing to bring the salmon back. It's important to my culture, especially.
So if the salmon comes back, that'll be great for the people, because we're salmon people.
Did you want to speak to that video at all, Wayne or Robyn, before we move it over to to questions, or do you still have more presentation left?
I just want to wrap up, and then we can go to Q&A. And that video is really about salmon and the water and sort of the restoration. I think yeah, it's about the Columbia system and salmon. So the conclusion of this is really about going back to the principles, our legal principles, and how does that all really connect? Clan and understanding the need for satwa, water, and life it brings. And I think it really is about, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Michelle, it's about listening. Seek and listen. Reconciliation is not about so much about talking. It's about listening and understanding and learning. And listening to, I think that was the biggest thing that came out of the 215 for many of our people, was that they finally felt that they were heard. Like for many, for over, I don't know how many years, many of them didn't feel they were heard. They didn't really feel that people were actually listening to them. And so the same with the knowledge we have about the land and water, is we really need people to listen and to really hear, our stories and how they relate to actually governance and water, and how that is really important. The Huhuatis Renkasaltan, we really need to begin to look at our impact as two-legged and economic activities, because the driving force for many things that happen in sort of civilization at this point, or the Eurocentric sort of economics, is economic activity. We get that, but we have to start looking at how does that impact people on the land, the animals, land, and the water, because there is an impact. Because when you do something, the ecosystem is all related. So when we talk about economic activities, how that affects, and we have to start looking at those kinds of things. Let's get real about it. Let's start talking about it. And because I think that's the issue that a lot of people have around sort of what's the balance? What's sustainable? And what can we do in such a way? Because we recognize, yes, people need to earn a living, but how do we do this in a sustainable way that can actually really benefit everybody? One of the things our ancestor leaders said in 1910 that was important, all they said is, we want the ability to earn a living off the land. And that's really an important statement, because it's no different than what every other person has come into our territory and used the land to earn a living. And I think we have to understand that's not something we seek the same type of things, but we need to have that dialogue. And I think that's what's important. And also, what are the obligations that those who benefit from the land and resources to those that have been affected by it? How do we get these corporations and entities to reinvest in something sustainable in relation to the water and the land, so that if they're doing something that's having an impact, what can they do to help invest, to help benefit the land and the water? Because just take like coyote, getting greedy in those stories, it's not going to benefit anybody. And eventually coyote is the one is always impacted by it, because he doesn't pay attention, he doesn't listen, and he's greedy in the scope of his beliefs. So those are important. Yukumintman, we have to think about this in terms of our obligation to the water. What is our obligation? What is our obligation to the water? What do we need to do? What's that reciprocal relationship? And I think it's really about understanding that it's a living entity, and we treat it as such. We pay it respect. We offer tobacco to it and pray for its health. Like it's helped us for so long, let's start helping the water. And that's an obligation, that's a spiritual connection that has a whole ramification in terms of we treat it as a living entity. It's different than if it's not a non-entity, it doesn't exist, but it has a spirit. So we have an obligation to take care of that spirit. like it's taken care of our lives and helped us. And how do our laws, the oral history we have, how does that inform us in terms of how we actually have that relationship and connect to each other and how we connect to the water? You see the stories, we're talking a lot about that. It's about reciprocal accountability. Everything, it's not just a take thing, it's a give and take. And how do we develop those relationships? And I think that, I guess, the issue of inherent rights that we have, what do we do? How do we take the issue from just, quote, the rights, but also the responsibilities and obligations we have to the water? Because that's really important, because yes, we may have rights, but without the responsibilities, it's not going to really matter, actually. Two major concepts that, Secwepemc concepts that are part of our foundational sort of laws and the stories we have are, and it's really important, the concept of Ktunaxa. And the translation is helping each other. And why it's important is that in Secwepemc, when you say Ktunaxa, it's not just the words helping each other, it's actually an action. Our language is verb-based, so it's actually doing something. So when people are talking about helping each other, Ktunaxa, it's actually doing something. You see this in our people when it comes together, when we're burying someone, how the community comes together to help each other at that time. And I think that those concepts are really important. Ktunaxa is really an important concept because it's the foundational thing of how we actually help each other. Not only the two-leggeds, but how do we help the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the water, the land, the medicines, all of that, all of creation. So how do we help each other? But the other one is Ktunaxa, and translation is help yourself. Because if we're going to sort of help each other, we need to help ourselves understand and how we can actually do what we need to do. So those two concepts go hand in hand, help each other and help yourself. Because those of you that are on this and have no knowledge of Secwepemc knowledge or Syilx or Ktunaxa, is how do you help yourself understand? One of the key things is a friend of mine said years ago to me, he says, you have to build a cognitive life raft. What does that mean? You have to build a mental understanding of what's going on, what's happening, why things are the way they are. And I think that that's the concept of helping yourself, build that cognitive life raft. And I hope through our actions here today and our sharing with you that we help you understand a little more about Indigenous ways and specifically Secwepemc ways of doing things and our knowledge. And there's such a great depth of it. It's hard to capsulize it in just little snippets that I gave to you. It wasn't even a Reader's Digest or Cole's Notes version. It was just little snippets out of these stories that are very detailed and very intertwined, but they give you a real concept of how the concepts of reciprocal accountability, about Ktunaxa, how you help each other and how you help yourself, because these are foundational to our ways of being as Secwepemc people, and it's our ways of being with the water, our ways of being with the animals, the land, etc. So it's really important to understand that. It's really, in terms of how we sort of move forward. So I want to say to all of you, Kukpi7 for listening, and Michelle, I'll turn it over and questions and stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. When you were talking about the Reader's Digest version, I was thinking it's almost like the tweets, right? We're given tweets because that's how little it is. If people can relate to that, right? Because it's like this grand volume, this lifetime, and we're trying to put them into tweets for you, right? For you to be able to understand, and what that does to our knowledge and what that does to our knowledge relationships, as we're doing research and so on, that becomes really a problem, right? So thank you so much for rising to the occasion and giving us some tweets, right? And giving us something to hold on to so that we can keep moving forward. I'm going to turn it over then to Emily, where she's You're
Hello.
not on my front page. There you are. Okay. I was like, where did you go? It moved. Go ahead.
A little bit. Thank you, Kukpi, for all your insight. That was an incredible presentation. First question we have is from Chris Holmes. You want to unmute yourself and join in on the chat?
Sure, thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? You can hear me. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. I have one question that is coming from the perspective of a practitioner. So often in our work, we come at water from the perspective of understanding water to be a hazard and a risk to communities. The concept of water as hazard did not come up today in these presentations, and I'm interested to learn your perspective on the considerations of water in that context.
Interesting question, because you know, as you were asking it, I was thinking, no, I don't think of water as a hazard. The reason I say that, the concept is really about water finds a way, no matter what. You know, and I think when we talk of flood mitigation as an example, flood hazard, etc., it's impacted by things that are man-made that create those situations. And I think that the concept of water being a hazard is really, you have to have the utmost respect for water, because like everything, it's like fire. Fire can give you life or take you, give you death. The same with water, the same concept. It gives life, but also it can take you. It can give death, you know, because it's that respect for the power that it has as an entity, and really have that concept. I've never ever thought of water as a hazard. You know, I think I respect it because it's the springtime flooding, as an example, that happens. It's a natural process that's been going on for thousands of years, and it's a purification of the if you want to call them the veins of Mother Earth. You know, think about that. It's a cleansing of those systems so that the water can flow and the salmon can come up and all of those things. And so you have to think about it in that concept. So that's why when you were asking a question, I was thinking, I don't view water as a hazard. And I think that it gives life and it can take life. So I think it's really important. I appreciate the question. It made me think. So thank you.
Can I make a suggestion there too, to think about as describing the concept or describing the action, might find the way to transform that understanding, like what you're actually trying to get, because I think that's an example of how our knowledge systems get shifted, right? Because you're trying to equate two concepts that actually the worldview it doesn't see it that way, right? And so when we bring this idea of hazard, it actually reframes our relationship. Sorry, go ahead, Emily, but that's just something that I'm very cognizant for Ktunaxa work that we're doing is not to horizontally interpret, but to actually understand what it is that we're talking about.
All right, the next question comes from Catherine Park. If you're still on, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello. Thank you so much, Wayne, for the excellent presentation, and to Robyn. It's been really interesting and enlightening. My question was about the industrial farms. I had no idea that so many of the industrial farms were taking place up in the interior with like so many head of cattle. And I'm wondering, these industrial farm owners, are there companies, are they open to discussions about ways to mitigate the damage that their industry is causing to the waterways?
Yes and no. You know, part of what it is that we're entering that discussion, but there's reluctancy on their part, quote, because of the legal liability. So we have to be mindful of their positioning and how they're positioning themselves. So the actual discussion with them has been limited. We've actually made overtures to the not the individual owners, but also the association of dairy cattle as the example. And so how can we begin to have some interplay that's going to create solutions? But we're really mindful from their position that they've taken. It's around legal liability and what they're able to do or not do, say or not say. So that's kind of where we're at this point. And we haven't really entered into a full dialogue. We've had discussions with them, but we've had no full dialogue with them at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Sally Hammond, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. I wanted to go back to the story about the Salmon Boy. I'm curious about what the interrelationship is between the king salmon and the salmon followers and their willingness to sacrifice their lives for the humans to be able to eat and feast. And I'm wondering, do the salmon pity the humans and that's why they agree to be eaten as kind of a gift? And I'm wondering where the reciprocal relationship is there. I'm sure there is one.
Yeah, you're making me think. I appreciate it. Yeah, the relationship with salmon, and I think that this is the whole concept of reciprocal, how we work with each other. They gave their lives to give us, and our job is to help them to return to where they, and where they were born. And I think that's that relationship we have and the waterways and how we actually do that. Our job is to help them get back home. And I think that that's why we really sort of incorporate that into that whole sort of thinking, especially with the king salmon or the Chinook salmon or Ktunaxa, because they have it's a different life cycle than the sockeye as an example. And so they have a real sort of process. And they, as an example, in the Shusharp River, and this goes back to geology that happened as the salmon ice dams that were broken and the water shifted. The king salmon here, the Chinook Ktunaxa, has the Columbia River DNA in them. And so it's that relationship of how we ensure that they get back to where, they were actually born, because there's that cycle. We help them continue to perpetuate their life, and they help continue to perpetuate our life by allowing us to eat them, and give us nutrition and all of those things. And it gives to the animals, the bears, the eagles, everything. It actually gives nutrients to the water. So the salmon gives quite a bit, gives back to everything. And that's kind of the reciprocal aspect of it. Thank you for the question. I appreciate that one. Thank you.
Ramona Faust, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the presentation. When I see these things, I always think, what if someone put 10 kilometers between myself and my vegetable garden, or blocked us from getting to the grocery store? So it's always very moving to think about what we're seeing. My question is about the Holkar presentation, and maybe it's for Robyn or Wayne. Has the Ministry of Environment or Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, Rural Development, or Agriculture been involved in the gathering of people that are coming together to discuss the issues there?
Robyn, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yep. Thanks for your question, Ramona. So short answer is yes. We are working with myriad of ministries who have something to do with water and drinking water. It's, quite honestly, I had to chart it out to try and keep track of all of the different players involved and try and gain some consensus about protecting the health of the water and how each of those ministries have different authorities and different sort of areas that they have to focus and that they're responsible for. It's quite something, and I don't know if that answered your question, but
yes, thank you. I just know that the general area has been looking at how to gain more local control for a very long time, and so I was just wondering if they had managed to involve different ministries in a collegial way. So thank you for that answer.
Thanks.
All right, we had another question from Chris who logged off, but he was wondering if your video is available anywhere online.
I believe it is. I'll have to send you a link to where it is. I don't have it at the top of my head, so yes, it is.
Our next question is from Nicole.
I mentioned to Emily, if there was time, I'd like to ask your reference to the cognitive life raft. Would you speak a little bit more about that in relation to the topic of water?
Yeah, it's interesting analogy with water, a cognitive life raft, because you think about it in the concept of water, it's about how do you build a mental understanding of what's going on, because it's like building that mental sort of understanding that, hey, this is what's going on with the water. And in some ways, if you look at it in the concept of trauma, the water is being traumatized by development, so to speak. And so what do we do to build an understanding of what's going on? Why is it happening the way it's happening? Why are we having these situations with water? And then you look at climate change comes into it, forestry comes into it, industrial development comes into it, recreational development. So building that understanding of what's going on, because it's not just one thing, it's a multitude of things. And I think we have to build that understanding so we can work together, because unfortunate part, the way the system works is it's kind of like you got a problem to create a solution, and then it starts to silo. You create all these ministries with a siloed effect, right? And they don't talk to each other. And so I think it's the collective, building a collective mental understanding or cognitive life raft that'll move us to where we need to go. So that's kind of how the concept that I use in relation to water.
Thank you, Kukpi Christian. That was what I was looking for. Thank you.
I also talk about intellectual sovereignty, right? And I think Ryan Day, right? He often talks about that intellectual sovereignty as well. And there's a number of Indigenous scholars that talk about the intellectual sovereignty. Vine Deloria, right, is a massive thinker about the power in place. Manulani Meyer, a number of different Indigenous folks that are usually what happens, and this is part of the problem, right? What happens is that the natural sciences really pushed Indigenous peoples into the humanities and then to study us as social sciences. And so we're just at the cusp of trying to have the conversation about the fact that our knowledge has always been deep science. But because of that interaction, didn't see us, first of all, as human beings. Secondly, as people, our knowledge was then put over here with the simple, with the problem, with, oh, they're backwards, And so it's that opportunity we have to start talking about this in this way, to not to validate what we know, because we know it, right? It's to actually embrace non-Indigenous folks and try and support your thinking about how you see us, how you interact with us, what the intellectual, relationship starts out as, right? And it's that really that suspending the disbelief that it's actually about making space, because we already know this, right? We know this deeply. And I think that trauma, like understanding that trauma for myself anyways, as an Indigenous person with all these kinds of trauma, that's how I look at the landscape, trying to help people to understand that, that's part of the reattachment to place we need, because that's going to heal us, because that's where the answers are, right? So, and I'm just taking a bit of time to let Emily catch up, because I know she went out to ask everybody if there's more questions. So I'm your Vanna White tonight, I guess. But do we have any more? No? Okay. So I wanted to, a couple of things before I forget. So one is that you are all going to get an email from Emily, our applied reconciliation. I don't know what the rest of your title is there, but Coordinator. Okay. She's going to be sending out a link to a Survey Monkey. Just a couple questions at the end. So next week, after next week, is that right? Do I have that right? After next week, we're going to send that out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's a simple survey, very, very simple survey to ask everybody. Basically, if you can participate in that, it's a very simple survey. I think it's like 5 questions to give Living Lakes Canada some feedback, but also something that we can also share back with our knowledge holders as we're going through this. But also in respect. So it's along the same lines as the gratitudes. And so I'm just going to ask the first 5 people who haven't said anything yet, where can one get the stories? Carmen, do you want to? Oh, okay, we've got some technical questions here going on. Where can we get the stories? And I'm assuming you're talking about the stories from today. Wayne, do you have an answer for that one? And then the webinar is posted on the website. Maybe Nicole, you can take that one.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, the stories there's sort of multiple sources. It's not just one source. So I'd have to sort of look at where they're actually sourced from. It's not footnoted. It's not like a paper on the bottom. Okay. Well, you know what I mean, right?
I know what you mean. Yeah. I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is when there's we're coming from an oral tradition, and that's still very much, even if we've read a book or read, I think of Ron and Marianne Ignaz's book. I have it, and I still look at that, and then there's a whole bunch of other things, right? There's a whole bunch, and it becomes a life way. Right, that's the life way, the cognitive orientation. So yeah, sorry we can't give you exact answer to that one. Nicole, do you want to let people know when the webinars might be posted? And then 5 people, I'm looking for 5. There it is. Secwepemc people lands Zita Botello. Oh, she's showing it to everybody there. 5 people. I'm just looking for 5 people who would like to share one thing that they are taking with them, that they've been gifted from today's presentation. So think about that while Nicole answers our question.
The recording to the first webinar will be sent out after this webinar concludes. So if you're registered, you'll get a link in your inbox. Otherwise, it will be on the website, linked on the registration page that you access to sign up. And we also have a YouTube channel, and it will be available on there. So Living Lakes Canada on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have one person so far. I have Valerie Evans. Valerie, if you want to go ahead, maybe somebody else will put up their name or put their name in the chat. That would be great. Somebody has their hand. Brenda Chambers. Go ahead, Val. Valerie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your sharing today. I really appreciate all the time it took to put this together. And I'm really grateful to be sitting with 5 pages of all of you people. I think my gratitude is for the energy of the space that was created here today. It was very welcoming and relaxing, and speaking to such challenging issues with humbleness and positive regard for possibilities for the future is really helpful in where I see myself playing a role. So I really appreciate the manner to which everyone's speaking to the facts of where we are. And like, okay, now we're here. This is what is. Now, where are we going with this? And that's the attitude I've discovered over the past couple years myself. And yeah, I just heard a lot of heart in the presentations, and it's easy when we talk about data to remove the heart out of it and get stuck up in here. But I think, I mean, in my own personal life, I've done a lot of discovery in terms of connecting with Indigenous folks in my work. I connect with a number of different communities, and I discovered my voice over the last couple years and my songs. I'm learning songs and stories and connection, and I'm bringing feelings into my workplace. And I think the world is waking up. Like, I've always known these, like what we're talking about today, it's like every human being can feel the truth of this in their bones. It's a matter of how can we move at a pace to sustain us whilst the framework that we've constructed that's supposedly taking care of us has, as you mentioned, built such rigid silos, and that's the challenging part. So I think just continuing to bring my heart to work and taking care of myself and connecting with the people in my home, making my home a home, and yeah, and connecting with my broader community as much as I can. So I feel like if anything, my gratitude is for not feeling alone, which is pretty huge with spending so much time in our homes these days. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Valerie. Let's see, I think Brenda, you had your hand up next, then we'll go to Carmen, and then we'll go to Dennis. Dennis. We're looking
Thank
for
you,
one more.
Michelle.
Yep.
I don't have a lot to say. This is the second one I've been in, and I'm new to this area of Canada myself. And I just wanted to share that I have been completely and utterly emotional from the start and still am. And I am so grateful to see this whole situation developing the way it is. I think it's so long overdue. And I'm so very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. How about you, Carmen?
Yes, hello. Yeah, thank you to the presenters and all the people who facilitated this workshop. It's my first one, and I'm really, really thankful for the amount of information. And I think I've gained more understanding about the importance of listening. And I like how Wayne always used metaphors or the stories actually to help us understand this process of our part in it, and that we are connected. And so I think I know I need to hear it more and more. And I think I work with children quite a bit, so as an artist in a classroom, and sometimes quite often I work in collaboration with First Nation people, and trying to illustrate, some stories, and just a repetition also. When you repeated things so many times over and over, and it's every time it's has a new meaning, it has a new depth. So I'm taking so much out of this meeting that I will certainly come back to the next ones. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Carmen. Dennis, am I saying that right, Dennis?
Yeah, Dennis Delisle.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for both of you. Thank you for Living Waters for organizing this. I've learned an awful lot. Maybe I built on knowledge I already knew. Appreciate the spiritual connection that's involved in all this. Appreciate the time that you took to teach us your way of seeing. appreciate your patience with us. We're slow learners. Guess that goes both ways. And while being a politician, I definitely know the difficulties of getting everybody to work together. And we also have a large job. We had, 150 people here? We have a large job of getting that information back to those people who are not interested, too busy. So this is a good first step. Kukpi7.
I'm going to ask Kat if you want to have any last words before we turn it back over to Wayne for closing.
Thanks, Michelle. I actually don't have any last words. I have gratitude. It's been one of the best afternoons I've had in my whole time with Living Lake. So I'm super grateful. And I'm also really grateful to learn that your language is verb-based. So that was, for me, was a good learning. And so I'll pass it back. Thank you so much. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Robyn.
So Wayne, how you doing? I think my gratitude is for you saying yes. It's always humbling for me. I'm a 60 scoop kid. I wasn't raised here, and I work hard to try to support people that want to know how to do differently. And so I'm always humbled when people like yourself say yes to me, because I'm one of those pitiful ones that is, I'm just learning. I'm just a baby. And so I'm really absolutely grateful for you, for your leadership, for your connection, for saying yes, and trusting I know what I'm doing, what I'm asking you to do. So I hold my hands up to you too, and I turn it over to you.
Kukpi7, Michelle. Robyn, do you want to say anything in closing before I close off? Robyn?
Oh, well, thank you, Kukpi and Michelle, Living Lakes Canada, all of the participants. I learn too through these processes all the time. Work in progress, and it is a huge transformation that we're working towards, and these are important parts of that. So Kukpi7 to everyone here, and thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. Just a few words before I close off with our farewell song. Michelle, when you first asked me, I was thinking, okay, what the hell am I going to present? Seriously, I was just thinking in my mind, how am I going to get across the concepts in a way that people will, first of all, listen? Because in these forums, it's hard to sit and listen, right? And how can I get across? So what as most of us have, we've got all these sort of PowerPoints we've done over time. And so I just sort of gathered, look, I quickly went through my mind, where do I? And there was actually a presentation that was supposed to be presented in Windsor, Ontario, on international Indigenous law World Conference. And this was a presentation that I didn't make it to be presented. So then I just pulled it up. I said, oh, okay, this is perfect. It was really interesting, actually. Then I went into the whole process of refining it a little, but the essence is the same, because I think that when we talk about, what we're talking about, water and sort of our knowledge. So I want to thank you for just sort of getting my, that part of myself back and knowing that it's there. So to all the organizers, thank you, because what you're doing here is really important, because in the time that we're in isolation and COVID, and our only way to connect is through this kind of technology. And it's hard to get all aspects of that connection, like when we were talking earlier, when you're face to face, you can just actually feel the energy. It's hard to feel the energy through the skin. It's hard to feel the nuances and that connection we have as human beings when we get together. And I know it's difficult, but I want to thank you for having this platform to do this, because it's a start, you know. And like I said, it's a way to connect in today's world that's safe and that we can, you know, look after ourselves. But more importantly, we can reach quite a wide range of people. And I want to thank all of you that asked questions and those of you that sat here and participated, because the end of the day, it's going to take all of us to make a change, you know. And I keep saying that it's as much as we think we're not the same, we are. And what I mean by that, we're all human. We have all sort of aspects of who we are. You know, we need water. You know, we need water to live, all of us. And if it's threatened, what are we going to do about it? All of us, not just one of us, but all of us. And I think that's the joy of what I see with this Living Lakes Canada and what we've done here today is to get that concept across, is we're in this together. And how do we actually make a difference now? How do we take what we know and move it forward a little? And maybe laterally to your family, maybe not necessarily others, maybe we just even within your family. Just take it laterally, you know, with those around you. Start educating them. You know, I think that's what's important. And I think how we just keep moving it. And I think that that's important. So I appreciate this opportunity, Michelle, and to the organizers again. And Robyn, thanks a lot, you know, for putting it all together. It helped. So I'm going to close off these songs that I'm singing, these Secwepemc songs. You have to understand this. I didn't really start singing these songs because, like Michelle, I'm a 60s scoop survivor. I was taken away from my family. But I came back, and then part of my role when I came back into my community is that I started to, there's a gap, and part of it is learning who we are. And these songs that I'm singing were taught to me by Gary Godfredson out at the Kamloops, and it comes from their elders and what they would sing in our Secwepemc way at the turn of the century when they welcome people in. Now I'm going to sing you the song when we say goodbye to people, the farewell song. And so when we say goodbye, and just as people would return to their homes, and but most of you are in your homes already, you know, but that's okay. So I'm going to sing you this song, and just again, I thank you for this opportunity. Safe journeys. Kukpi7, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kukpi7.
Yeah.